So what if the single biggest reason you can't get over your past mistakes um, isn't because you aren't trying hard enough, but because you've just been misdiagnosing the disease entirely?
Oh, that happens all the time.
Right. I mean, imagine treating a life-threatening infection with, like, a bandage. That is essentially what we do every single day with our internal lives.
hmm
We treat the crushing weight of shame with the medicine that's actually meant for guilt.
Yeah, and neurologically speaking, doing that is just like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Exactly.
It absolutely is. And, it's a trap almost everyone falls into because on the surface, shame and guilt, they feel so similar. They both show up when we've messed up.
Yeah, you get that pit in your stomach.
Right. But the internal machinery driving them, and more importantly, the way they literally rewire your brain, couldn't be more different.
Yeah.
If you don't correctly diagnose which one is operating in the background, every attempt you make at healing is just going to misfire.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. We've been looking at a truly fascinating stack of research for this deep dive, pulling from modern clinical psychology, neurobiology out of UCLA, and some surprisingly deep ancient biblical theology to figure out exactly how shame operates and how to dismantle it.
It's an incredible overlap.
It really is, because it turns out the ancient texts and the modern fMRI machines, they're pointing to the exact same cure.
Yeah, it's one of those rare topics where every discipline just seems to converge perfectly.
Hmm.
To start unraveling this, we really have to draw the hard line between guilt and shame.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, clinical researcher Brene Brown has mapped this out beautifully. It essentially comes down to a shift in focus. Guilt is behavioral. It's the voice that says, I did something bad.
Right.
But shame, on the other hand, is an internalized identity. It's the voice that says, I am bad.
So it's the difference between making a mistake and, like, genuinely believing you are the mistake.
Ex
I always think about it like getting a speeding ticket. Guilt is getting pulled over, looking at the ticket and realizing, wow, okay, I was driving dangerously fast. I need to slow down.
Yes, very logical.
Right. It's specific, it's tied to an event, and it prompts a change in behavior. But shame is getting that exact same speeding ticket and concluding, I am a fundamentally reckless, defective danger to society. I'm just a terrible person.
I shouldn't even be allowed to drive.
Exactly. I'm a burden to everyone around me. It
Yeah.
spirals so fast.
That is a brilliant way to frame it because it exposes how shame completely distorts our cognitive processing. Dr. Neil Nedley's work in cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, deals directly with this.
So yeah.
He identifies this specific mental distortion, and he calls it global self-evaluation, or just labeling. And there is a very real physical mechanism in the brain that causes this to happen. It's not just, a bad attitude.
It's biological.
It is a neurological regression.
Walk me through what is actually happening in the brain when that shift occurs, because it feels like such an extreme leap from, I was driving too fast to, I am a defective human being.
It's a huge leap, and it has everything to do with which part of your brain is running the show in that exact moment. Healthy, accurate self-assessment. That requires your frontal lobe.
Okay.
That's the advanced executive part of your brain capable of holding complexity, holding nuance, context. Your frontal lobe can look at a failure and say, I made a mistake in this specific context at this specific time because I was rushing.
But it doesn't mean I'm garbage.
Right. That one action does not define my total worth as a human being.
It can separate the act from the actor?
Precisely. But when you experience intense stress or fear or chronic emotional pain, your brain interprets that as a literal survival threat.
Like a physical danger?
Yes. So it starts pumping out stress hormones, which essentially suppress the frontal lobe and hand control over to the limbic system.
Which is your brain's primitive alarm center.
Exactly. And the limbic system doesn't do nuance. It's just fight, flight, or freeze. It operates in completely binary categories, safe or dangerous, good or bad.
There's no gray area at all.
None. So when your frontal lobe goes offline, you literally lose the biological capacity to hold a complex view of yourself.
Wow.
You collapse your entire multifaceted identity into a single damning label. You become the mistake.
That explains so much. It explains why it feels so impossible to just, like, think rationally when you're in a shame spiral, because your rational hardware is literally powered down.
Exactly. You can't outthink it in that state.
And it's fascinating because this neurological collapse maps perfectly onto a distinction made over a century ago by the theologian Ellen G. White. She wrote extensively about the difference between genuine moral guilt and what we would now call false or neurotic guilt.
Yes, her analysis of this is razor sharp. Genuine moral guilt arises from an actual transgression, right? It has a very logical sequential cure.
Right, you acknowledge it.
You make a specific confession, you repair the damage if you can, and you accept forgiveness. Boom, the cycle closes.
But false guilt is different.
Completely. False guilt, which is really just shame in a religious disguise, is the continued agonizing self-condemnation for things that have already been forgiven or resolved.
And what's wild is how often people dress that false guilt up as piety. I see this all the time.
Oh, absolutely.
People think that beating themselves up for years over a forgiven mistake makes them look humble. They think, if I keep punishing myself, it proves how seriously I take my faith or my morals.
White cuts right through that illusion, though. She points out that holding on to false guilt isn't humility at all. It is actually a form of unbelief masquerading as humility.
Unbelief masquerading as humility. Man, that is a gut punch.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because to continue condemning yourself after God, or even a loved one, for that matter, has forgiven you, is, in effect, refusing to believe in the adequacy of that grace.
Yeah, it's like saying, your forgiveness isn't quite enough to cover this.
Exactly. My situation is special, so I need to add my own self-punishment to the tab to really make it right.
Right.
It's an incredibly arrogant position, just hidden under the guise of self-deprecation.
So if shame is this corrosive, identity-collapsing mechanism that just shuts down our frontal lobe and secretly rejects grace, what does the fallout actually look like? Like, if someone is listening to this deep dive right now and wondering if shame is secretly running their life, what are the behaviors they should look for?
Well, the most universal consequence of shame is the hiding cycle. And if you want to see how this plays out perfectly in human behavior, you don't even have to look at modern clinical studies.
Oh, really?
No, the oldest recorded breakdown of this psychological cycle is actually the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we all know the basic plot of the Garden of Eden, but when you look at it purely as a psychological case study, the details are staggering.
They really are.
Because before the fall, the text notes, they were naked and not ashamed.
Which is a profound statement about vulnerability. That nakedness wasn't just physical, it represented total transparency.
Yeah.
It meant being fully known, having zero secrets, and being completely at peace with being seen.
There was no fear of rejection.
None at all.
But wait, hold on. I want to struggle with this Genesis example for a second. When they eat the fruit, their immediate reaction is to hide. But isn't hiding just basic self-preservation?
How do you mean?
Like, when I mess up at work and break a major rule, I might avoid my boss so I don't get fired. How is Adam and Eve hiding any different than just a logical fear of punishment?
It's a great question, but the text is actually much more precise than just a fear of punishment. Look at the exact sequence of events. Their eyes were open, they knew they were naked, they sewed fig leaves to cover themselves, and then they hid from the presence of terror.
Oh, the covering happens first.
Exactly. Shame did not enter the human experience because nakedness was suddenly discovered. Shame entered because the relationship that made nakedness safe was broken.
So it's not the fear of the broken rule, it's the terror of the broken relationship.
Precisely. Shame is fundamentally a relational terror. It is the paralyzing fear that your true self, if exposed and truly seen, is so defective that it will be abandoned.
Wow.
That's why their immediate response and our immediate response today is twofold: covering and hiding.
So the fig leaves are the covering. But what does covering look like for us today? I'm not sewing leaves together.
Well, covering today is the exhausting performance of acceptability. It's image management.
Oh, man.
It's constructing a false self, a highly curated persona, to present to the world because your limbic system is screaming that the real you is completely unacceptable. You project perfection or extreme competence or even defensive anger.
Just to keep people away from the core defect.
Yes. And the hiding is the literal withdrawal from intimacy. Pulling back from deep conversations, avoiding eye contact, ghosting friends when you're struggling.
Just completely isolating yourself.
Yeah. Which brings us perfectly back to Brené Brown's modern clinical findings. She discovered that shame requires a very specific ecosystem to survive and grow. It needs three things: secrecy, silence, and judgment.
Secrecy, silence, and judgment.
Yes. When we engage in covering and hiding, when we keep our struggles a secret and stay silent out of a fear of judgment, we think we are protecting ourselves. But neurologically, we're providing shame with the exact fertilizer it needs to take over our entire internal life.
Okay, so this is the trap. The brain is locked in the limbic system, holding a trial where the verdict is always guilty and driving us to hide, which only makes the shame stronger.
A vicious cycle.
So if shame thrives entirely in the dark, we need an intervention powerful enough to just shatter that courtroom. How do we break the cycle? Let's look at how a 2,000-year-old legal text actually accomplishes what we try to do in modern therapy.
You're referring to Romans 8.1, which states, "There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." It's one of the most famous verses in the text, but the original Greek language reveals exactly how it dismantles the psychology of shame.
Right, because the word used for condemnation there is katakrima.
What's fascinating here is that katakrima isn't just a vague feeling of divine disappointment. It's not like a parent shaking their head.
Right.
Katakrima is a strict, undeniable legal term. It refers to the formal, binding sentence handed down by a judge upon a guilty party. It is the ultimate gavel strike.
But the text says, for the person in Christ, that verdict is completely voided.
Completely.
It doesn't say the sentence is reduced. It doesn't say you get put on, like, parole or probation based on good behavior. The katakrima is 0.
And that is the radical intervention. When your brain's internal courtroom is screaming that you are fundamentally defective and worthy of abandonment, you cannot just argue with it using your own logic. You need a higher ruling.
A completely external verdict.
Yes. When you internalize that the highest court in reality has already handed down a voided sentence, it actively interrupts the cognitive loop of self-loathing. You cannot successfully condemn yourself when the ultimate judge has refused to do so.
We see this exact psychological dynamic beautifully illustrated in the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15.
Oh, absolutely.
We all know the setup, right? The younger son demands his inheritance, squanders it recklessly, ends up destitute feeding pigs. But I want to skip past the plot and look at the clinical psychology embedded in his lowest moment. The text says he came to himself.
That phrase is everything. He came to himself.
Yeah.
Because the far country he was living in wasn't just a geographical location, it was a cognitive state. He had been living in a distortion. Coming to himself is the moment his frontal lobe finally comes back online.
The fogless.
The survival mode fogless, and he can finally make an honest assessment of his reality.
But even with his frontal lobe back online, his shame is still deeply rooted because what does he do? He plans a speech. He decides he's going to go back to his father and say, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. He is still defining his entire identity by his failure.
Which is the textbook definition of the global self-evaluation label we talked about earlier. He believes his mistake has permanently altered his essence. He was a son, now he is merely a servant.
Wow.
And this is where the father's response absolutely shatters the ecosystem of shame.
The father sees him from a distance and he runs, which in an ancient Middle Eastern village was incredibly significant.
It was culturally humiliating. An older patriarch of a wealthy estate simply did not run. It required pulling up his robes, baring his legs, losing all his dignity in front of the community.
But why does he do it?
Because the father knows that if the village reaches the son first, they will mock him, shun him, and enact the rituals of shame upon him. The father sprints to absorb that shame himself. He takes the public humiliation so the son doesn't have to.
And before the son can even finish his rehearsed speech about being a servant, the father cuts him off.
Yes, he interrupts him.
He immediately orders the best robe, the family ring, and sandals.
And those aren't just nice gifts. They are profound markers of status. Slaves didn't wear robes and rings. Sons did.
Right.
And notice, the father doesn't say, go take a shower, work in the fields for 6 months, prove you've changed, and then you get the ring.
There's no probation.
There is no probationary period. The father refuses to let the son negotiate his identity based on his behavior. The restoration is immediate and unconditional.
So we have this incredible framework, the voided sentence of katakrima, the father running to restore the son. So what does this all mean for you listening right now?
That's the core question.
Because it is deeply moving to hear a story about grace. But if you are currently trapped in a shame spiral, simply looking in the mirror and telling yourself, I'm a beloved child of God, well, it can feel completely impossible to believe.
It feels like lying to yourself.
Exactly. If my core belief is, I am fundamentally defective, trying to just think happy, positive thoughts is like taking a sled down a snowy hill.
Okay, I like this analogy.
My brain has spent years carving a deep, icy groove of self-condemnation into that hill. If I just try to steer out of it with a quick positive affirmation, the sled just slides right back into that deep rut. It's automatic. So, how do we actually do the grueling work of rewiring our brains, carving a new neural pathway to accept this grace?
Well, you're describing the reality of neuroplasticity, which is the foundation of cognitive behavioral therapy's work on core belief restructuring. You really do have to carve a new path. But there is a massive, crucial difference between using secular affirmations to do this versus using biblical identity statements.
Right, because secular affirmations often fall flat when you're in the pit of shame. Standing in front of a mirror saying, I am enough, I am worthy, it feels incredibly hollow when your limbic system is screaming that you're a fraud.
It feels hollow because of the mechanism required to make it work.
Yeah.
A secular affirmation requires your compromised, shame-filled self to somehow convince your compromised, shame-filled self of its own worth.
Oh,
You are trying to generate an identity from within a system that is currently failing. You are the judge, the jury, and the defendant all at once.
it's just a closed loop.
Exactly. It's a closed loop. But biblical affirmations like Ephesians 1.5, which says we are predestined for adoption as children, they bypass this closed loop entirely because they're externally grounded. They're anchored in the unchanging character of God, not your fluctuating self-perception.
You don't have to generate the identity, you just have to receive the verdict that has already been spoken over you. It's an objective reality.
Yes. And as you practice receiving that, as you repeat those external truths, especially when you don't feel them, you are physically carving that new path in the snow. You are building new neural connections that eventually allow your brain to default to grace instead of condemnation.
That is so powerful.
But there's one final, vital step in this rewiring process. It goes directly after the secrecy and silence that Brené Brown identified as the fuel for shame.
Okay, and this is where we get into the neuroscience of confession, right? Matthew Lieberman, a researcher at UCLA, discovered a neurological principle he calls name it to tame it. He found that when a person verbalizes a negative emotion, when they explicitly name the fear, the guilt, or the shame they are feeling, it measurably reduces the activation of the amygdala, the brain's threat center.
The mechanism behind this is fascinating. When you are feeling raw shame, your limbic system is hoarding all your brain's energy and blood flow.
It's stealing all the power.
Exactly. But the moment you try to translate that raw, abstract feeling into structured language, you force your brain to route the signal through the prefrontal cortex, the logic center.
Because language requires structure and logic.
Right. So just by searching for the right words to describe your shame, you are literally sapping energy away from the fear center and redirecting it to power up your rational brain. Naming the shame forces the frontal lobe back online.
That is incredible, and it shows that the biblical commands we see in 1 John 1.9 about confessing our sins and James 5.16 about confessing our faults to one another, they aren't just archaic religious rituals.
Not at all.
Confession isn't about God needing an information update on what you did. He already knows. Confession is a profound neurobiological and spiritual healing mechanism.
It is the exact reversal of the Genesis 3 hiding mechanism. Adam and Eve hid in the dark. Confession drags the shame into the light. And when we do that in the context of community, we fully engage Brown's shame resilience theory.
Because shame dissolves through empathy.
Precisely. If secrecy and silence are the fuel for shame, empathy is the antidote. When you finally stop covering, when you speak your shame out loud to a safe, trusted community or in prayer to God, and the response you receive is not the disgust you expected, but rather, I see you, I know this about you, and I still love you, the ecosystem of shame is completely dismantled.
It just falls apart.
It cannot survive in the light of unconditional acceptance.
We've covered some incredibly profound ground today in this deep dive. To synthesize all of this for you, shame is a highly effective liar. It hijacks your brain's alarm system to convince you that you are fundamentally defective, that your identity is permanently tied to your worst mistake, and that your only option for survival is to cover up and hide.
But you do not have to live in the far country of that cognitive distortion.
Exactly.
You break the cycle by doing the very thing shame tells you not to do. You step out of the shadows. You utilize the neurobiological power of confession, bringing the darkness into the light. And you replace the internal damning label of your limbic system with the external unbreakable truth that there is no condemnation for you. Your identity is a gift you receive, not a pristine status you have to earn and exhaust yourself maintaining.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as you go about your week. It's a massive paradigm shift regarding how we view our own brokenness.
Yeah. If shame relies entirely on secrecy, hiding, and the terror of being exposed in order to survive, what happens to its power? If you change your definition of vulnerability? What if you begin to view your deepest vulnerabilities not as liabilities that must be fiercely hidden, but as the exact coordinates where you can experience the most profound connection with God and with others?
Wow.
What if the places where you feel the most broken are actually the only places where you can truly be found?
That reframes absolutely everything. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take that thought and that grace with you into your week.